To understand the Darkin, you have to travel back to a time before the ruins, before the buried cities, before the sand swallowed the temples whole. You have to go back to Shurima, when Shurima was not a graveyard but a garden of power, and when the beings who would one day become the Darkin were still counted among the finest souls ever raised from mortal flesh. Their fall was long. It was slow enough that the people living through it may not have understood what was happening until it was far too late. And it began, as so many tragedies do, in a place of light. Talking about light, why don't you light up that subscribe button before we get into this amazing, most relaxing / interesting video you will ever see. Okay, enough of that. Shurima rose in the desert, which is the first strange thing about it. Deserts are supposed to be where things end, where water runs out and travelers turn back, yet the Shurimans built one of the mightiest civilizations Runeterra had ever seen across that unforgiving expanse of sand and heat. They raised cities that gleamed under a merciless sun, and rather than hide from that sun, they worshipped it, studied it, and eventually learned to draw power directly from its light. The heart of that power sat above the empire in the form of a great disk, a construct of gold and old magic that hung in the sky and channeled the sun's energy down into the world below. The Shurimans called it the Sun Disk, and it was far more than a monument. Through it, and through the rituals their priests and rulers guarded closely, a single mortal could be lifted out of their ordinary life and remade into something vastly greater. A champion could be chosen. A champion could stand beneath that disk, and if they were deemed worthy, they could be transformed into one of the Ascended. It is worth sitting with that word for a moment, because everything that follows grows out of it. Ascension was not a metaphor in Shurima. It was a physical, magical elevation of a person into a god warrior, a towering figure of immense strength who often took on the features of beasts, and who could stand against threats no ordinary army could hope to face. The Ascended were the pride of the Empire, its guardians and its living legends, and to become one was the highest honor a Shuriman could ever be given. The champions most people know from that age carry those beast forms still in memory. There was the Emperor who reached for ascension and was betrayed at the very moment of his triumph. There were the two brothers, one who kept his nobility and one who lost himself to rage, whose stories echo through the sands to this day. And there was a sorcerer whose ambition would help bring the whole empire crashing down. Those names belong to the later fall of Shurima, and that fall is a separate story from the one being told here, so hold them lightly. The Darkin came from the same order of the Ascended, but their tragedy began in an earlier age, in a war that most people have forgotten even happened. Because before the Empire fell, before the sun disk went dark and the cities were buried, the Ascended served as exactly what they were meant to be. They were protectors. They were the shield of Shurima and the answer to every threat that came against it. When something rose that mortal soldiers could not stop, the Ascended went out to meet it, and for a long and glorious stretch of history, that arrangement held. The god warriors kept their people safe, and their people loved them for it. If the story had stayed there, we would remember the Ascended only as heroes. We would tell their tales the way we tell tales of any great defenders, with pride and a little awe. But history rarely lets its heroes rest, and the Empire of the Sun was about to be tested by something that had no business existing at all. Something that came not from a rival kingdom or a foreign army, but from a wound torn in the world itself. To feel the weight of what the Darkin lost, you first have to understand what they once were, and that means understanding Ascension not as an event, but as a life. A mortal chosen for the ritual did not simply gain muscle and height. They were remade from the inside out into a being of a fundamentally different order. And that change touched everything about them, their body, their power, and in time, their mind. An Ascended stood far above an ordinary person in every measurable way. They carried strength that could shatter stone and turn back armies, endurance that let them fight through wounds that would kill any mortal many times over, and lifespans that stretched so long they may as well have been called immortal by the people who lived and died in their shadow. To a Shuriman farmer or soldier, an Ascended was not a stronger version of a human being. An Ascended was closer to a walking god, and the Empire treated them accordingly. That reverence was not blind. The Ascended earned it again and again on battlefields where nothing else could have won. When the Empire faced enemies too vast or too strange for conventional warfare, the god warriors carried the day. They were the reason Shurima endured for as long as it did, and the reason its borders held against the many dangers that pressed in on a civilization that rich and that powerful. Every great empire attracts enemies, and Shurima's enemies had to reckon with the fact that the Empire could field beings who did not tire, did not age, and did not easily fall. There is a quiet tragedy hidden inside that gift, though, and it only becomes visible with the benefit of everything that came after. The very things that made the Ascended magnificent, their endurance, their long lives, their capacity to keep fighting long past the point where any mortal would have broken, were the same things that would later damn some of them. A mortal soldier who has seen too much horror can at least eventually die and be free of it. An Ascended who had seen too much horror had no such escape. They would keep living. They would keep remembering. And they would keep going back to the fighting, because that was what they were built to do. For a long time, none of that mattered, because the wars they fought had endings. Threats came, the god warriors met them, and afterward the Empire knew peace again, at least for a while. The Ascended could return home as heroes. They could rest, in whatever way beings like them rested, and let the memory of battle fade before the next one arrived. The rhythm of threat and victory and peace kept them whole, and kept them recognizably themselves. What finally broke that rhythm was not a bigger army or a crueler king. It was a war with no ending built into it at all. A war against an enemy that could not be reasoned with, could not be permanently killed, and did not stop coming, no matter how many times it was thrown back. That war would take the finest beings the Empire had ever produced and grind them, slowly, across years and then centuries, into something the Empire could no longer control. To understand how that happened, we have to talk about Icathia, and about the terrible thing the Icathians chose to unleash rather than lose. Every empire has its edges, and at the edges are the peoples who resent being ruled from a distant capital. Icathia was one such place, a province bound to Shurima that never fully made peace with that binding. The details of its grievances are old and half buried now, but the shape of the story is one that repeats across all of history. A subject nation grew tired of answering to a greater power, and eventually that tiredness curdled into open rebellion. Rebelling against Shurima was not a small decision. This was the empire of the Ascended, the civilization that could field god warriors, and any province that raised its hand against the capital had to know what it was inviting. The full weight of Shuriman power was not something a single rebellious region could hope to match in a fair fight. The Icathians, whatever else they were not fools. They understood the odds they faced, and they understood that a conventional war of soldiers against god warriors was a war they could only lose. So they went looking for something that was not conventional. They went looking for a weapon that could level the impossible imbalance between themselves and the Ascended host that would surely be sent to crush them. And in their search, in their desperation to find any advantage that might let them stand against an empire of living gods, they found something. They found a power old and vast and utterly beyond their understanding. A power that promised them the strength to win, and they made the choice that every cautionary tale is built around. They reached for it anyway. What they reached for was the void. It is difficult to describe the void in a way that does it justice, because the void is not simply a monster or an army or a rival magic. It is closer to an absence given hunger, a nothing that wants to unmake something, a force associated in the oldest accounts with entities called the Watchers. It does not conquer territory the way a kingdom conquers territory. It consumes, it erodes. It turns the living world into more of itself, and it does not stop, because stopping is not a thing the void knows how to do. To open a door to that power in the hope of using it as a weapon was to misunderstand, catastrophically, what kind of thing was on the other side of the door. The Icathians opened the door anyway. In their rebellion, in their refusal to kneel, they tore a wound in the world and let the void pour through, believing they could aim it at their enemies like any other weapon. For a brief and terrible moment, perhaps it even seemed to work. But you cannot aim a thing that has no interest in your goals, and the void had no loyalty to the people who had loosed it. It devoured Icathia, and then it kept going, spreading outward from that broken place, threatening not just the empire the Icathians had hoped to defeat, but the entire living world beyond it. Shurima now faced a crisis unlike anything in its history. This was not a rival to be defeated and absorbed. This was an existential threat, a spreading corruption that would eventually consume everything if it was not stopped. And there was only one force in all the empire capable of meeting it. The Ascended would have to go to war against the void itself. And the empire, not yet understanding what that war would cost, sent its greatest heroes marching toward the wound in the world. When the Ascended marched against the void, they marched with confidence, and they had every reason to. These were the beings who had never lost, the champions who had turned back every threat the Empire had ever faced. They had strength beyond mortal reckoning, and lifespans that made ordinary fear almost meaningless to them. If anything in the world could stand against the spreading nothing that had swallowed Icathia, it was the god warriors of Shurima, and they went to that war believing they would win it the way they had won everything else. The being who led them into that darkness deserves a name here, even though her full story sits at the blurred edge of the record and is worth confirming before it is stated as certain. The accounts remember a great leader among the Ascended, a warrior queen named Sitaka, who stood at the head of the host and tried to hold her people together as the darkness spread. She was a figure of the sun, tied to the very light that had raised the Ascended in the first place, and she carried the burden of command through a war that would have crushed a lesser will. Setika's role was not simply to fight. It was to keep the host whole, to keep them recognizable to themselves even as the war began doing everything in its power to tear that wholeness apart. Because the war against the void was not like the wars the Ascended had won before. Those earlier wars had rules of a kind. They had armies you could rout, kings you could kill, and endings you could reach. The void had none of that. You could destroy its creatures, and more would come. You could push it back from one place and find it seeping in from another. There was no capital to burn, no ruler to behead, no treaty to sign that would make it stop. Because the void does not want the things that wars are usually fought over. It simply wants to unmake, and it has all the patience of a thing that cannot die. So the god warriors fought, and fought, and fought again. They won engagements without winning the war. They held lines that could not stay held. They watched ground they had cleared become corrupted once more, the moment they moved on to the next crisis. For beings whose entire identity had been built on the certainty of victory, this was a new and disorienting kind of horror. A war that gave them no clean triumph to return home to. No peace on the far side of the fighting. No rest. And here is where the length of their lives, once their greatest blessing, began to turn against them. A mortal army in an endless war can at least be relieved. Its soldiers die or grow too old to fight, and new soldiers who have not yet been broken take their place, so that no single person has to carry the entire weight of the whole conflict. The Ascended had no such mercy. The same god warriors who marched out at the beginning were still fighting years later, and then decades later, and then longer still. They did not get to hand their trauma to a replacement. They accumulated it, layer upon layer, with no end in sight and no death to release them from it. The war ground on, and it began, very slowly, to change the ones fighting it. This was not a sudden corruption. There was no single moment when a hero became a monster, no dramatic instant of transformation. It was the erosion of centuries, the wearing down of even the noblest souls by a horror that would not end and could not be won cleanly. The Ascended had been built to endure anything, and so they endured this too. But enduring a thing is not the same as surviving it whole. Something in them was being hollowed out, slowly, one atrocity and one impossible battle at a time. Setaka fought to hold them together against exactly that hollowing, and for a long while, perhaps, she managed it. But the pressure never let up, and the war never turned the corner toward a real ending, and the finest warriors the world had ever produced kept living through a nightmare that no living thing was ever meant to survive. The empire that had sent them believed it had dispatched its heroes to win another victory. What it had actually done was condemn them to a slow and grinding transformation, and by the time anyone understood the true cost, the beings who came back from that war would no longer be the heroes who had marched into it. The war against the void did eventually end, or at least it ended enough. The wound was contained. Icathia, the province that had loosed the nightmare, fell and was sealed away from the rest of the world. Its rebellion drowned in the very power it had summoned. The spreading nothing was pushed back from the edge of consuming everything, and the living world drew a shaking breath and survived. By any measure the Empire should have understood as victory, the void had been stopped. But the beings who stopped it did not come home as heroes. Because the beings who came home were not entirely the heroes who had left. Centuries of a war with no ending had done their work. The Ascended who had marched out as the shield of Shurima returned as something colder, crueler, and far more dangerous. Warriors who had been shaped by endless slaughter until slaughter was the only thing that still felt like anything at all. They had spent so long fighting that they no longer knew how to stop, and they had lost so much of themselves in that fighting that there was little mercy left in what remained. These were the Darkin. Not a separate species, not invaders from some other place, but the Empire's own god warriors, corrupted by the very war their people had sent them to fight. The tragedy of the Darkin is not that a monster came from outside and destroyed the heroes. The tragedy is that the heroes and the monsters were the same beings, that the war did not replace them, but transformed them. and that everything terrible they would go on to do was done with the strength and the immortality Shurima had gifted them precisely so they could protect it. The word Darkin has come to mean many things in the tellings that survive, but at its root it names this: an Ascended who fell, a god warrior who was broken by war and remade into something that hungered for it. They kept their power. They kept their near-immortal endurance. What they lost was the reason they had once wielded those things: the loyalty and the love of their people that had given their strength a purpose. Without that anchor, the Darkin were left with nothing but the war itself, and a war to a being like that is not a horror to be ended. It becomes the only thing that gives existence any shape at all. It did not happen to all of the Ascended. Some held on to who they had been, and their stories run in other directions across Shuriman history. But enough of them fell, and the ones who fell were among the most powerful beings the world had ever produced, and now they were coming home from a war that had taught them there was no such thing as a battle worth refusing. The Empire had sent out its protectors. It got back a horror it had made with its own hands, wearing the faces of its greatest heroes, and it had no idea yet how much worse things were about to become. Because a Darkin freshly returned from the Void War was not yet the enemy of the world. That would come. But the seed was planted, the corruption was set, and the finest warriors of Shurima now carried inside them a hunger that peace could never satisfy. It was only a matter of time before that hunger turned outward, before the god warriors who could no longer stop fighting went looking for someone to fight. And when they did, they would not be picky about who. With the void contained, the Empire expected its god warriors to stand down. That expectation was the last innocent mistake Shurima would make about the beings it had created. The Darkin did not stand down. They had been remade by a war that never ended, and now that the war against the void had finally quieted, they did the only thing their hollowed-out natures still knew how to do. They found a new war. They turned on the world they had once protected, and on each other, and the conflict that followed would come to be remembered as the Darkin War. This was a different kind of catastrophe from the Void. The Void was an alien hunger that unmade whatever it touched. The Darkin was something more intimate and more terrible, because they had been the world's defenders, and they knew exactly how to hurt the people and the places they had once kept safe. They understood war the way only beings who had done nothing else for centuries could understand it. They fought with the strength of god warriors and the cruelty of minds that had been ground down past the point of caring, and the ancient world had no answer for them, because the only force that had ever been strong enough to stop such beings was the very force that had now become the threat. The devastation was immense. Large stretches of the old world were torn apart in the fighting, cities and peoples caught between Darkin, who no longer recognized any reason to spare them. And the worst of it was that there seemed to be no way to make it end. You could not defeat a Darkin the way you defeated an ordinary enemy, because a Darkin could not be permanently killed. Their bodies could be broken and their forms could be scattered, but the essence of them, the thing that made a Darkin, endured through that destruction and simply took shape again. To fight them was to lose ground you could never fully win back. Exactly as it had been in the war against the Void, except now the unkillable enemy had once been your own protectors and knew all of your weaknesses. The Darkin also turned on one another, and this is one of the most revealing things about what they had become. These were not united conquerors marching under a single banner. They were broken god warriors, each with their own hungers and their own visions of what the world should be forced to become, and they fought among themselves as readily as they fought everyone else. The old accounts, especially the ones Aatrox himself would later tell, dwell on this internal betrayal, on the way the Darkin devoured their own, on the schemes and treacheries that ran between them even as they laid waste to everything around them. Whatever kinship they had once shared as the Ascended host had rotted into rivalry, and they turned their terrible strength against each other with the same lack of mercy they showed the world. There are names that surface in these tellings, remembered as individual Darkin who left their mark on that age, though the specifics of each are worth treating with care. The accounts recall a Darkin who could cross distances in an instant, and who betrayed the others in pursuit of remaking the world in his own image. They recall another remembered as a kind of unmaker, a figure of ruin even among ruinous beings. What matters more than any single name is the pattern they all trace. The pattern of beings who had been heroes and were now something that could not be trusted, not by the world, and not even by one another. For the mortal peoples caught in the middle of all this, it must have seemed like the end of everything. Their gods had turned on them. The protectors they had loved were now the horror they most feared, and no army they could raise had any hope of stopping beings who could not die. The Darkin War was not a war anyone was winning. It was a slow apocalypse, and it would have run until there was nothing left to destroy, if the mortals of that age had not found, at last, a desperate and unnatural answer to a problem that had seemed to have no answer at all. The problem the ancient world faced was stark and seemingly impossible. The Darkin could not be killed. Everything that had ever worked against a powerful enemy failed against them, because those methods all rested on the same assumption, that if you struck hard enough, the enemy would fall and stay fallen. The Darkin refused to stay fallen. Their essence outlasted the destruction of their bodies, and so long as that essence endured, the Darkin endured with it, ready to take shape again and return to the slaughter. If you cannot kill a thing, and you cannot reason with a thing, and you cannot outlast a thing that lives longer than you and everyone you will ever know, then only one option remains. You have to contain it. You have to find a way to lock the thing away so completely that it can no longer act on the world, even though it goes on existing inside its prison. And that is the answer the mortals of that age finally reached for. An answer that was less a victory than a kind of grim compromise with a horror they could not truly defeat. The mages and smiths of the old world developed a technique to bind a Darkin into a weapon. Not an ordinary weapon, but one forged of a dark and living metal, an object crafted specifically to hold the essence of a being that could not otherwise be held. Into these weapons the Darkin were sealed, their vast power and their endless hunger poured into the shape of a blade, or a bow, or a scythe, and trapped there. The immortality that had made them impossible to kill became the very thing that kept them imprisoned, because a being that cannot die also cannot escape its cage by dying. It simply persists, locked away, aware, and waiting. This is one of the cruelest ironies in the whole history of the Darkin. The gift of ascension, the near-immortal endurance that had made them the pride of Shurima, became first the engine of their corruption, and then the lock on their prison. They could not be freed by death because they could not die. They could only be sealed, and once sealed, they would remain sealed for as long as their weapon stayed untouched by a living hand foolish or unlucky enough to pick it up. The sealing did not heal them, it did not end them, it only silenced them, for a time. And so the Darkin War came to a close, not with the enemy defeated, but with the enemy contained. The god warriors who had become monsters were scattered across the world in the form of beautiful, terrible weapons, hidden away or lost or buried under the accumulating weight of centuries. The mortal peoples who survived did their best to forget. They let the memory of the god warriors fade, let the truth of what those weapons held blur into legend, and got on with the long work of rebuilding a world the Darkin had nearly destroyed. For most of them, the Darkin became a story, if they remembered them at all. But a sealed Darkin is not a dead Darkin. Inside those weapons, the essence of each fallen god warrior remained, conscious and furious and unbroken, enduring the long silence of imprisonment with all the terrible patience of a being that has nothing but time. They could not act. They could not move. They could only wait and remember and hunger. Across years that stretched into centuries and centuries, that stretched into an expanse of time so vast that the empire which had created them crumbled to dust and blew away while they lay dormant. The world went on. The Darkin waited. And a weapon, however well hidden, has a way of eventually finding a hand. Try to imagine the length of the imprisonment, though imagine is perhaps the wrong word for a being that experiences it. The Darkin were sealed away in an ancient age, when Shurima still stood or was only beginning to fall, and they remained sealed as that empire collapsed, as the desert reclaimed its cities, as entire civilizations rose and flourished and died in the world above their hidden weapons. Thousands of years passed. The people who had sealed them were forgotten. The reasons the weapons had been hidden were forgotten. Even the Darkin themselves faded from the memory of most of the world, surviving only as fragments of legend, as warnings whose meaning had been lost. Through all of it, the essence trapped in each weapon endured. This is the part that is genuinely difficult to sit with. A being locked in a cell can at least pace, can at least see the walls, can measure the passing of time against the rhythm of days. A Darkin sealed in a blade had none of that. It had only itself, its memories of a war that had broken it, its hunger, and the crushing awareness that it could not act. For a being that had been built to fight, to move, to overwhelm, an eternity of enforced stillness is a torment almost beyond describing, and the Darkin endured that torment not for years, but for an expanse of time that dwarfs the entire history most people know. Whatever remnants of the old heroes still flickered inside those beings would have had a long time to gutter out in the dark. Whatever cruelty the Void War had planted in them would have had a long time to deepen and calcify. Imprisonment is not a gentle teacher, and thousands of years of it, spent conscious and powerless and alone, is not the sort of thing that softens a being. If the Darkin had been dangerous when they were sealed away, they were something worse when they finally woke. Because they had spent every one of those long silent years marinating in resentment, in the memory of betrayal, and in a hunger that the passage of time did nothing to dull. Some of them dwelt especially on the betrayal. From their point of view, and there is at least one Darkin whose point of view we know quite well, the sealing was not justice, but treachery. They had been the protectors of the world. They had gone to war at the world's command, had fought the void when nothing else could, had endured horrors on the world's behalf, and their reward had been to be imprisoned by the very people they had once shielded. Whether or not that framing is fair, it is how at least one of them came to understand what had happened. And a being that spends thousands of years nursing a sense of betrayal does not emerge from that time inclined toward forgiveness. So the weapons waited, scattered across a world that had forgotten them, each one holding a broken god warrior who would eventually, inevitably, be found. Because that is the nature of a weapon, especially a beautiful and powerful one. Sooner or later, someone finds it, Sooner or later, a hand reaches out, drawn by the weapon's power, or its beauty, or simply by the accidents of history, and closes around a hilt, or a haft, or a bowstring that has waited across the ages for exactly that moment. And when that happens, the long silence ends, and the Darkin gets to do the one thing it has hungered for through all those centuries of stillness. It gets to live again, in a body that will not, at first, understand what it has just taken hold of. The way a Darkin returns to the world is one of the most quietly horrifying details in the whole story, because it does not require an army or a ritual or a great convergence of dark powers. It requires only a person and a moment of contact. When a living being takes up a Darkin weapon, the ceiling that has held the Darkin in place begins to fail, and the essence trapped inside reaches out toward the warmth of the life now touching it. What follows is not a partnership, at least not usually. It is a slow devouring. The Darkin does not simply possess the wielder in an instant. It works into them gradually, feeding on them, drawing on their body and their will, reshaping them from the inside to make them a suitable vessel. A person who picks up such a weapon may feel, at first, only its power, only the intoxicating strength it seems to offer. They may believe they have found a great gift. But the gift is a trap, and every day they carry the weapon, a little more of them is consumed, and a little more of the Darkin takes its place, until the person who first reached out is gone entirely, and only the Darkin remains, wearing and reshaping the body it has claimed. This is why the Darkin still walk Runeterra thousands of years after their war ended. They were never truly destroyed, only sealed, and every time one of their weapons finds a wielder, a Darkin gets to return, using a stolen and remade body as its vessel. The god warriors of ancient Shurima have outlived their empire, their war, and their own imprisonment, and they persist by consuming the living, one host at a time. Each Darkin still active in the world is walking in a body that once belonged to someone else, someone who reached for a weapon and lost themselves to it. Not every Darkin experiences this the same way, and not every one of them approaches the relationship with a host identically, which is a distinction that becomes important as we turn to the individuals themselves. Some devour their hosts with cold contempt. Some fight the wielder for control across a long and vicious struggle. And at least one has come to see the arrangement in a stranger and almost gentler light, though gentle is a relative word when speaking of beings like these. But the underlying truth is shared across all of them. A Darkin lives by taking a life and wearing it, and the return of a Darkin always begins with a person who thought they had simply found a remarkable weapon. Now that the shape of the whole tragedy is clear, from the glory of the Ascended to the horror of the Void War, from the fall into the Darkin to the long silence of the ceiling, we can finally turn to the individual god warriors whose stories the world still knows. These are the Darkin who have found their way back into a hand, who walk in stolen bodies through a world that has largely forgotten what they are. Their stories are the living edge of a history thousands of years old, and each one shows a different face of the same ancient ruin. We begin with the one who remembers the most, and who wants, more than anything, for all of it finally to end. Of all the Darkin, Aatrox is the one whose story sits closest to the heart of what they were and what they lost, because he was, before everything else, the greatest of them. In the age of the Ascended, he stood among the finest god warriors Shurima ever raised. A genuine hero, in a time when that word meant something enormous. He was not a monster who later put on a hero's face. He was a hero first, and everything terrible he became was built on the ruin of everything good he had been, which is exactly what makes his story so heavy to carry. Aatrox went to the wars the Ascended fought, and like the others, he was changed by them. The being who emerged from that long transformation was no longer the champion who had gone in. He fell as the finest of them fell, and he was sealed away as the others were sealed away, bound into a great blade when the mortals of the old world found their desperate answer to the horror the Darkin had become. But sealing Aatrox did not silence what he remembered, and it is his memory, more than anything, that defines him now. Because Aatrox remembers all of it. He remembers being a hero. He remembers the war that broke him. He remembers the betrayal, as he understands it, of being imprisoned by the world he had bled to protect. And he remembers the endless silent centuries of that imprisonment. When Aatrox tells the story of the Darkin, he tells it as one who was there for every part of it, and the telling is bitter, because he does not believe he was a monster who deserved his cage. He believes he was a protector who was chained by cowards and left to rot, and thousands of years of imprisonment did nothing to soften that conviction. What Aatrox wants now is the thing that makes him perhaps the most tragic of all the Darkin. He does not want to rule the world. He does not want to conquer it or remake it in his image. What Aatrox wants is for it to end, including himself. His imprisonment taught him that existence itself is the cage, that to be is to suffer, and that the only real freedom left to a being like him is oblivion, the complete end of everything. He has been called the harbinger of exactly that. A warrior who fights not for victory, but for annihilation, and there is a terrible logic to it. A being that cannot die, and has spent eternities wishing it could, might well come to see the end of all things as the only mercy left in the world. His own words carry that weight. Aatrox has described himself as the end of all things, and it is not a boast so much as a purpose. Where another conqueror might dream of a throne, Aatrox dreams of a silence so total that even he is finally released from it. In the story he tells of the Darkin, he lingers on the betrayal, on the injustice of the sealing, on the long torment of a hero remade into a weapon, and then locked away. And every part of that telling feeds the same hunger. He wants out. And for Aatrox, the only door out of an existence that has become nothing but suffering is the destruction of existence itself. When Aatrox returns to the world, he does it the way all the Darkin do, by taking a body. A warrior on the edge of death, someone reaching in a desperate moment for a weapon that seems to promise the strength to survive, is exactly the kind of hand his blade waits for. And when that hand closes around him, the blade drains the wielder, reshapes them into a towering, winged figure of terrible power, and Aatrox walks again, wearing a stolen life on his march toward the end he believes the whole world deserves. The hero is gone. What remains is the memory of the hero, sharpened into a blade, still furious about a betrayal thousands of years old. It is worth staying with Aatrox a little longer, because his story is the clearest window into the tragedy of all the Darkin, and because the version of him the world knows now was not always the version that existed. The Aatrox of the current age, the fallen hero who longs for oblivion and remembers his own betrayal, replaced an earlier telling that painted him in far simpler and far less sympathetic terms. The lore was rewritten, and the rewriting turned a straightforward warrior of blood into something more layered and more sorrowful. A being whose villainy is inseparable from a genuine and ancient grief. That change matters, because it reframes what the Darkin are. Under the older telling, it was easier to see them as simply evil, powerful monsters to be feared and fought. Under the story as it now stands, they become tragic. Aatrox is not evil in the way a scheming tyrant is evil. He is broken, and his brokenness came from doing exactly what his people asked of him. From being the shield of the world until the world had ground the heart out of him, and then chained what was left. When he rages against the injustice of his sealing, part of what makes it disturbing is that he is not entirely wrong. He did protect them. They did imprison him. The moral clarity that would let us simply hate him is not fully available. Consider what Aatrox actually lost, laid out plainly. He lost his purpose, the loyalty and love that had once given his enormous strength a direction. He lost his people, who first sent him into a war that destroyed him and then locked him away for what that war had made him. He lost his very self, the hero he had been, hollowed out and replaced by a being that can conceive of no future except ending. And he lost, in the end, even the possibility of death, the one release that might have freed him from all of it. Because the immortality that had been Shurima's gift became the seal on his eternal imprisonment. Everything he was given was turned into a way to make him suffer. From inside that ruin, oblivion starts to look less like madness and more like the only coherent wish left. If existence has brought you nothing but war, betrayal, and imprisonment across an unimaginable span of time, and if you cannot die to escape it, then the destruction of existence itself becomes the only exit you can imagine. Aatrox does not seek the end because he is cruel, or at least not only because he is cruel. He seeks it because, from where he stands, the end is the only thing that could possibly be better than what he has. That is a horror of a very particular kind. The horror of a being who has been hurt so thoroughly that annihilation reads to him as relief. This is why Aatrox stands at the center of the Darkin story. The other Darkin show us different faces of the same fall, but Aatrox carries the whole arc within himself. From hero to monster to a being who longs only for the silence at the end of all things. When you understand him, you understand what the war against the void really cost. Not in cities or in soldiers, but in souls. It took the best the world had to offer and returned them as beings who could imagine no future worth having. And it left them, at last, sealed in weapons, waiting for a hand, carrying a grief and a fury that thousands of years could not touch. The next of the Darkin we turn to fell in a different way, and his story shows how the corruption can spread not through a single warrior, but through love. Varus is among the oldest of the Darkin, and his story is different from Aatrox's in almost every way except the ending. Because Varus shows us how a Darkin can return not by devouring a stranger, but by working its way into the bond between two people who would do anything for each other. His is the story of a corruption that spread through love, and it is, in its own way. Even sadder than the tale of the fallen hero, because the people it destroyed reached for it willingly, and for the best of reasons. Like the other Darkin, Varus fell in the ancient wars and was sealed away, his essence bound within a weapon and hidden in Ionia, that distant land of spirits and old magic, where Aatrox's blade would eventually find a dying warrior. Varus waited in a place tied to a temple, his essence contained and dormant, until the day two people came looking for a power that could save them. That was the moment his long imprisonment cracked open, and the way it happened reveals something about how the Darkin exploit the very best in the people they claim. The two who came were Ionian hunters, and their names are worth confirming carefully though the accounts remember them as Valmar and Kai. They were bound to each other, and when catastrophe threatened to separate them, when one of them faced death and the other could not bear to let it happen, they made a desperate choice. To save one another, they reached for the power sealed in that place, the corruption that was Varus. And they touched it, drank it in, took it into themselves. They did it out of love, out of the refusal to lose each other, and that refusal was exactly the door the Darkin needed. What resulted was not a simple possession. Valmar and Kai were not devoured and replaced the way Aatrox devours a host. Instead, the two of them and the ancient Darkin were fused together into a single being, one body now sharing three consciousnesses, the two lovers and the god warrior whose corruption had bound them. Varus walks the world in that merged form, and inside him the two Ionians who reached for his power in the name of love remain, tangled together with the ancient thing they woke. It is a strange and terrible union, three wills in one shape. The Darkin and the two people whose devotion to each other gave it the opening it had waited ages for. There is a particular cruelty in the way Varus returned. Aatrox preys on the desperate strength of a dying warrior, which is grim enough, but Varus found his way back through devotion, through the most human impulse there is, the refusal to let someone you love be lost. Valmar and Kai did not reach for the Darkin out of ambition or greed. They reached for it because they could not bear to be parted, and the corruption rewarded that love by binding them forever to itself and to each other, in a body none of them fully controls. It is a reminder that the Darkin do not only exploit weakness, they exploit whatever a person cares about most, and sometimes what a person cares about most is another person. Varus, then, is the Darkin's intimate tragedy, the ancient corruption that lives now inside a fusion of two lovers who wanted only to stay together. His story shows that the fall of the Darkin did not end with the Darkin themselves. It reaches forward across the ages, catching new people in the same old ruin, using their best qualities against them. Where Aatrox carries the grief of the ancient war within himself, Varus carries two more recent souls, folded into his own, a living monument to how the corruption keeps finding new ways to spread. And the next Darkin we turn to shows perhaps the most direct struggle of all, a battle for a single body fought in real time between the god warrior and the man who dared to wield him. Rast is the Darkin whose nature is easiest to see at work, because his story is not set in some distant age, but plays out in an ongoing struggle for control, moment by moment, between the god warrior and the man who carries him. Where Aatrox devours a dying warrior, and Varus fused with two lovers long ago, Rast is locked in an open contest for a single body. And that contest has not yet been decided. He is the clearest living demonstration of what it actually means to wield a Darkin, and of how a weapon slowly eats the hand that holds it. Rast is a scythe, and the man who took him up is Sheda Kane, an assassin trained in the Order of Shadow. Kane was no ordinary soldier who stumbled onto a cursed weapon. He was a killer of real skill and real ambition, schooled under the shadow-wielding master Zed, and when he claimed the Darkin scythe, he believed he could master it, that his will and his training would let him wield Rast's power without being consumed by it. That belief is exactly the kind of confidence the Darkin feed on, and Rast has spent every moment since working to prove it wrong. The relationship between the two of them is a constant, grinding battle for control, and Rast is patient about it in the way only an ancient thing can be. He does not need to win in a single stroke. He needs only to wear Kane down, to press against his will, to wait for the moments of weakness and doubt and exhaustion, knowing that time is entirely on his side. Cain is mortal, or close enough to it. Rast has already endured ages of imprisonment, and outlasting one determined young assassin is a small thing to a being that has outlasted an empire. The struggle between them can go one of two ways. Either Cain masters the weapon and bends its power to his own purposes, or Rast consumes him, takes his body fully, and walks the world as a Darkin once more, using the assassin's stolen form as his vessel. Rast himself is brutal and mocking, and he makes no secret of what he intends. He does not pretend to be a gift or a partner. He tells Cain, in effect, what is coming, taunts him with the certainty of his eventual defeat, and treats the young man's resistance as a temporary inconvenience rather than a real obstacle. There is a cruelty in that honesty, a confidence that borders on boredom, as though the outcome is so assured that the only entertainment left is watching the wielder struggle against it. That is the voice of a being who has been sealed in a weapon for ages, and has learned exactly how the story of a Darkin and its host tends to end. What makes Rast so useful for understanding the Darkin as a whole is that he shows the possession as a process rather than an event. With the Darkin of the ancient past, we hear about the corruption as something already complete, a fall that happened long ago. With Rast, we get to see it happening, the slow tug-of-war between an ancient hunger and a mortal will, the daily erosion, the patient pressure of a thing that cannot die working against a man who can. Every day Cain carries the scythe. Rast is there, waiting, pressing, certain it is the clearest picture the world has of what it truly means to pick up a Darkin weapon and believe you can control it. Whether Cain ultimately holds on or falls, Rast embodies the essential warning of the Darkin. The warning that a weapon which offers you enormous power at the cost of yourself is not a bargain, but a trap dressed as a bargain. The assassin took up the scythe, believing he was strong enough to use it. Rast has spent every moment since demonstrating why so many, before Cain, believed the same thing and were wrong. And in that ongoing struggle, the whole tragedy of the Darkin plays out in miniature, an ancient corruption patiently unmaking a living person who thought they were the one in control. The final Darkin we turn to breaks the pattern in a surprising way and shows that even among these beings, not all of them approach a host with the same contempt. Naafiri is the strangest of the Darkin, and in some ways the most unexpected. Because she overturns almost everything the other three lead you to assume about how these beings work. She is not a single blade waiting for a single hand. She is a pack, and her return to the world revealed a version of the Darkin that is not quite like anything the ancient war seemed to produce. She reawakened in the desert, in the same sands that once held the empire of the Ascended, and she came back into the world under a title that captures her nature well. She is called the Hound of 100 Bites. Where the other Darkin were sealed each into a single weapon, Naafiri's essence is spread across many blades, scattered shards of a single being. Rather than take one host and reshape one body, she manifests as a pack of hound-like creatures, her will running through all of them at once. It is a fundamentally different shape for a Darkin to take, less a lone monster and more a coordinated multitude, and it makes her harder to think about in the same terms as Aatrox or Rast. There is no single body that is Naafiri. There is a pack, bound together by one ancient mind, hunting as one. That difference in form comes with a difference in temperament, and this is where Naafiri becomes genuinely surprising. The other Darkin approach their hosts as prey, as bodies to be devoured and worn, as struggles to be won. Naafiri sees the relationship differently. To her, the bond between a Darkin and the being it joins with is closer to a partnership, the bond of a pack, where each member has a place and a purpose. She frames the union not as a hostile takeover, but as a joining, a pack coming together, and that framing makes her the most collaborative of the Darkin, though collaborative is a word that has to be handled carefully when speaking of a being like this. It would be a mistake to hear that and imagine Naafiri as gentle or safe. She is still a Darkin, still one of the corrupted god warriors of the ancient world, still a predator at her core. But her instinct toward partnership rather than pure consumption sets her apart, and it raises a fascinating question about the Darkin as a whole. If one of them can conceive of the bond with a host as a pack rather than a meal, then the utter contempt the others show may not be the only possibility built into their nature. Naafiri suggests that the corruption did not erase every capacity for connection, that even among beings this ancient and this broken, something like loyalty can still take shape, however predatory its form. Naafiri also serves as a reminder that the Darkin are not a closed and finished chapter of history. Her reawakening in the desert, thousands of years after the ancient wars, shows that these beings are still surfacing, still returning, still finding their way back into a world that has largely forgotten them. She came back recently, in the grand span of the Darkin story, and her return proves that the sealed god warriors of the old empire are not all accounted for, that the sands and the ruins and the forgotten places of the world may still hold more of them, waiting. The story of the Darkin is not only a history. It is an ongoing thing, and Naafiri is proof that new chapters of it are still being written. With Naafiri, the four Darkin the world knows best come into focus, and together they map out the range of what these beings can be. Aatrox is the fallen hero who longs for the end. Varus is the intimate corruption that spread through love. Rast is the patient struggle for a single body, playing out in real time. And Naafiri is the pack, the surprising one, the Darkin who sees a partner where the others see prey. Four faces of the same ancient ruin, each showing a different way that the fall of the Ascended still reaches into the present world. But these four are not the whole of it, and to close the story properly, we have to talk about the ones we cannot yet name. The four Darkin the world knows are the ones who have found their way back into a hand, but they are almost certainly not the whole of what the ancient wars produced. When the god warriors of Shurima fell and were sealed away, they were not sealed one or two at a time. The Darkin War was a catastrophe waged by many of the Empire's greatest Ascended, and the answer the mortal world reached for. The binding of each Darkin into a weapon would have had to be applied across all of them. That means the weapons scattered at the end of that war were not few. They were many, and most of them have never been accounted for. Somewhere in the world, then, more Darkin are almost certainly still sealed, still conscious, still waiting inside beautiful and terrible weapons that have not yet found a wielder. They lie in ruins the desert swallowed long ago, in forgotten vaults, in places where the memory of what they contain has blurred into nothing more than legend. Each of them holds a fallen god warrior, enduring the same long silence the others endured, nursing the same ancient grievances, hungering for the same return to a world that has forgotten it ever feared them. The sealing did not end the Darkin threat. It only paused most of it, indefinitely, until chance or ambition brings each weapon back into a living grasp. This is part of what makes the Darkin so unsettling as a piece of the world's history. They are not a closed threat. a danger that was faced and finished in some distant age. They are an open one, a set of loaded weapons scattered across the world, any one of which could return a corrupted god warrior to life the moment the wrong person picks it up. The story of Naafiri reawakening in the sands thousands of years after her fall is not a strange exception. It is a preview. It is what happens again and again whenever another of the sealed weapons finds its hand, and there is no reason to think it has stopped happening. The leaders of the Ascended host, the ones who tried to hold their people together through the war that broke them, hover at the edge of this part of the story. The warrior queen remembered in the old accounts, who stood at the head of the host and fought to keep the god warriors whole as the darkness spread, represents everything the Darkin might have remained if the war had not ground them down. Her story is worth confirming in its particulars, but the shape of it matters here regardless. Someone tried to hold them together. Someone stood against the corruption and fought to keep the Ascended recognizable to themselves, and in the end, that effort was not enough to save all of them from the fall. The very best leadership the host had could not stop what the war was doing to them, and that failure is part of why the Darkin exist at all. There is a lesson buried in that, and it is a bleak one. The fall of the Darkin was not a failure of courage, or of leadership, or of strength. The Ascended had all of those things in abundance. They were led by great warriors, they fought with unmatched power, and they endured longer than any mortal army could have dreamed of enduring. And still they fell, because the thing that broke them was not something courage or strength could overcome. It was time and horror and a war with no ending, applied to beings who could not die and so could not escape it. No amount of heroism was going to save warriors who were condemned to keep fighting forever. So the unaccounted Darkin wait, and the world goes on above them, mostly unaware. Every ruin explored, every ancient weapon unearthed, every desperate hand reaching for power in a dark moment carries the faint possibility of waking another one. The history of the Darkin is not safely in the past, sealed away and finished. It is scattered across the present, dormant and patient, and it is only ever one wrong grasp away from continuing. That patience, that endless waiting, points to the thing that lies at the very center of the whole tragedy, the curse that made the Darkin what they are and keeps them trapped in what they became. At the heart of the Darkin story sits a single terrible irony, and everything else grows out of it. The gift that made the Ascended magnificent, the near immortal endurance that let them stand against threats no mortal could face, is the very thing that damned them and then imprisoned them. Their immortality was never truly a blessing. It was a slow-acting curse that took ages to reveal its true nature, and by the time it did, the beings who carried it had no way to escape. Think back to what that endurance meant during the war against the Void. A mortal army in an endless war has a mercy built into it, the mercy of death and replacement. Its soldiers eventually fall or age out, and fresh soldiers who have not yet been broken take their place, so that no single person carries the entire unbearable weight of the whole war. The Ascended had no such mercy. The same god warriors fought from the beginning of that war to its distant end, accumulating every horror without relief, because they could not die and could not be replaced. Their immortality, which had always been their glory, became the mechanism of their corruption, forcing them to endure a nightmare that would have been survivable only if they had been able to escape it through death. Then, once they had fallen and been sealed, that same immortality became the lock on their prison. A mortal enemy, once defeated, stays defeated, because a mortal enemy can die. The Darkin could not, And so they could not be defeated in that final sense. They could only be contained, sealed into weapons, imprisoned rather than killed, precisely because there was no way to end them. The immortality that had forced them to endure the war that broke them now forced them to endure the imprisonment that followed it, conscious and powerless across ages. At every stage of their story, the gift of not dying was turned into a source of suffering. And for at least one of them, that irony became the whole of his purpose. Aatrox, who remembers everything, came to understand his immortality as the deepest torment of all, the thing that denied him the one release that might have freed him. He cannot die. He has been made to endure war, betrayal, and imprisonment across an unimaginable span of time, and the natural exit from all of that, death, is closed to him forever. That is why he longs for oblivion, for the end of all things, because if a single being cannot die to escape its suffering, then only the end of everything could possibly release it. His hunger for annihilation is immortality's final cruelty, a being wishing so completely for an end that it can imagine no future except the destruction of the world. There is something almost unbearable in following that logic to its conclusion. We tend to think of immortality as the great prize, the thing mortals have dreamed of across all of history, the escape from the one certainty that frightens us most. The Darkin are the answer to that dream, and the answer is a warning. They show what immortality actually does to a being that is then subjected to horror without end. It does not free them, it traps them. It removes the one door out and leaves them to endure whatever comes with no possibility of escape, until enduring itself becomes the torment, and death, the very thing mortals fear, becomes the mercy they can no longer reach. The Darkin, then, are not merely fallen heroes or ancient monsters. They are a study in what happens when you give a being everything it could want and then take away its ability to ever stop wanting, or suffering, or being. Their immortality made them gods, and then it made them monsters, and then it made them prisoners, and through all of it, it made them unable to escape. That is the curse at the center of the whole story, and it turns everything the Empire meant as a gift into the engine of an eternal tragedy. It also shapes the last cruelty of the Darkin, the one visited not on themselves, but on everyone unlucky enough to pick up their weapons. Every Darkin still active in the world walks in a body that was never its own. This is the last cruelty of the whole story, the one that reaches out of the ancient past and lands on ordinary living people in the present, and it is worth dwelling on, because it is easy to focus on the tragedy of the Darkin themselves and forget the people they consume in order to return. For every god warrior that walks again, there is a person who reached for a weapon and was erased. The way a Darkin returns always begins with a hand and a moment of contact, and it always ends with a stolen life. Someone finds one of the ancient weapons, drawn by its power or its beauty, or simply by the accidents of where they happen to be standing when the world put a legendary blade within their reach. They take it up, and for a while, it may feel like the greatest thing that has ever happened to them. The weapon offers strength, offers power, offers the feeling of being far more than they were, and then, slowly, it begins to feed. The wielder is drained, reshaped, hollowed out from the inside, and a little more of the Darkin takes the place of a little more of the person, until the person is gone entirely and only the Darkin remains, wearing and remaking the body it has claimed. The warrior whose desperate grasp gives Aatrox a new form does not get to keep their life. Valmar and Kai, who reached for Varus out of love, are folded forever into a being none of them fully controls. Kain fights every day to keep from being consumed by Rast, and the outcome of that fight is not certain. In each case, the return of a Darkin is built on the destruction or the subjugation of a living person, and that person's fate is not a side effect of the story. It is the mechanism of the story. The Darkin do not return despite the people they consume. They return by means of them. There is a particular horror in how the Darkin exploit not just weakness, but the best in people. A warrior reaches for Aatrox's blade to survive, out of the will to live. The Ionian lovers reached for Varus out of devotion to each other. Even Kain took up Rast out of ambition and confidence, the belief that he was strong enough to bend the weapon to his purpose. In every case, it is something real and human in the person, the will to live, the capacity for love, the drive to be great, that the Darkin uses as its way in. The corruption does not only prey on the wicked or the foolish. It preys on whatever a person values most and turns that value into the door through which it walks back into the world. Naafiri complicates this picture in the one way that offers a sliver of something other than pure horror. She frames the bond with a host as a partnership, a joining of a pack rather than a devouring, and while that framing must be held with real caution, given what she is. It suggests that the consumption of the host is not the only way the Darkin can conceive of their return. It hints that even in these beings, the capacity for something like connection was not entirely burned away. But she is the exception that proves the rule, and the rule is grim. For most of the Darkin, coming back means taking a life and wearing it. And the person who once owned that life is simply gone. This is why the Darkin are not only a threat of the distant past. Every one of their sealed weapons is a trap laid for some future person, a promise of power that is really a sentence of erasure. The history of the Darkin is written in stolen bodies, in the lives of people who reached for a weapon and lost themselves to it. And it will keep being written that way for as long as those weapons remain in the world. The god warriors of ancient Shurima persist by consuming the living, one host at a time, and that persistence connects the horror of the ancient wars directly to anyone unlucky enough to find one of their blades. It is a story that, as we will see, the world has never fully settled on how to tell. One of the strangest things about the Darkin is that the world has never fully agreed on their story, and the telling has shifted over time in ways that change how we are meant to understand them. This is not a minor detail for anyone who cares about the lore, because the version of the Darkin most people know now is not the version that was told in earlier days. The accounts have been revised, sometimes dramatically, and following how they changed tells us something about how these beings are understood. Take Aatrox, the greatest of them. There was an older telling in which he was a far simpler figure, a warrior defined mostly by blood and violence, a monster who was easy to fear and easy to condemn. The story as it now stands replaced that with something far more layered, the fallen hero who remembers his own betrayal and longs for the end of all things. The change turned a straightforward villain into a tragedy, and in doing so, it changed the meaning of the Darkin as a whole. Under the older story, they were simply evil. Under the current one, they are broken, and their villainy is inseparable from a genuine and ancient grief. Varus went through a similar transformation. An earlier account made him something quite different, tied to a temple and a role that had little to do with the ancient corruption. The current telling reveals him as one of the oldest Darkin, his essence bound in a weapon. His return achieved through the love of two Ionian hunters who fused with him. That revision did not just add detail, it moved Varus from the margins into the center of the Darkin story, making him one of the clearest examples of how the corruption spreads, and how it exploits the best in people. The being the world thought it knew turned out to be something older and darker than the earlier story had suggested. It would be easy to treat these shifts as mere inconsistency, but there is a more interesting way to hold them. The Darkin are ancient beings whose history stretches back thousands of years into an age most of the world has forgotten. And the truth of what they were and what happened to them is exactly the kind of thing that would come down to us in fragments, contradictions, and revisions. Different tellings emphasize different things. Older accounts get corrected as more is understood. The story of the Darkin is old enough and buried deep enough that we should expect it to be uncertain in places, and to be retold as the pieces are slowly recovered. This is why it is worth being honest in any account of the Darkin about where the story is firm and where it is still shifting. The broad shape is clear and consistent. They were the Ascended of Shurima, broken by the war against the void, fallen into corruption, sealed into weapons, and returning now by consuming the living. That arc holds across every telling. But the finer details, the exact names, the precise fates, the specific mechanisms, are the places where the accounts have changed before and may change again. And a careful telling holds those lightly rather than insisting on them. The revisions also carry a kind of poetry, whether or not anyone intended it. A story about beings who were remade, whose very natures were rewritten by forces beyond their control, is itself a story that keeps being rewritten. The Darkin were once heroes and became monsters, once protectors and became prisoners, and the tale of them has been told one way and then another as the world slowly recovers what really happened in that ancient age. There is something fitting in that instability, as though the uncertainty of their story mirrors the uncertainty of what they became. And beneath all the revisions, one of the darkest and most consistent threads is the way the Darkin turned, in the end, against their own. For all that the Darkin devastated the mortal world. One of the most telling facts about them is that they did not spare one another. They were not a united army of conquerors, marching under a single banner toward a shared goal. They were broken god warriors, each carrying their own hungers and their own visions of what the world should be forced to become. And they turned their terrible strength against each other as readily as they turned it against everyone else. The Darkin War was not only a war of Darkin against the world. It was, in large part, a war of Darkin against Darkin. This internal treachery runs through the oldest accounts, especially the ones Aatrox himself tells. When he speaks of that ancient age, he dwells on the betrayals, on the way the Darkin devoured their own, on the schemes and rivalries that ran between them even as they laid waste to everything around them. Whatever bond they had once shared as members of the Ascended host. That great order of god warriors who had fought side by side against the void had rotted into something poisonous. The kinship curdled into rivalry, the comrades became enemies, and beings who could not be killed turned their unkillable strength against each other in a conflict that had no natural end. The old tellings remember individuals within that fracturing, though their specifics are worth treating with the same care as everything else at the blurred edge of the record. There is a Darkin remembered for the power to cross distances in an instant, who betrayed the others in pursuit of remaking the world according to his own design. There is another recalled as a kind of unmaker, a figure of ruin even among ruinous beings. The particular names matter less than the pattern they trace together, the pattern of beings who had once stood united as heroes and were now so thoroughly broken that they could not even trust one another. Their corruption did not just make them cruel to the world, It made them incapable of loyalty, even to their own kind. That detail deepens the tragedy considerably, because it shows how completely the war against the void had hollowed them out. The Ascended host had been a brotherhood of sorts, warriors who fought together for a shared cause, bound by the loyalty and purpose that gave their enormous strength its direction. The Darkin retained the strength, but lost everything that had bound it. Stripped of purpose, stripped of loyalty, stripped of the love that had once anchored them, they had nothing left to hold them together, and so they came apart, each pursuing their own ruinous vision, each willing to destroy the others to get there. The Fellowship of Heroes became a scramble of monsters. It also helps explain why the Darkin could ultimately be contained at all. Beings that powerful, if they had remained united, might have been genuinely unstoppable, an unbreakable host of immortal god warriors bent on a single purpose. But they did not remain united. They fought each other, they schemed against each other, they weakened each other, and in doing so they may have made it possible for the mortal world to find its desperate answer and seal them away one by one. Their corruption, in a bitter twist, was part of what allowed them to be defeated. The same brokenness that made them monsters made them a broken thing, unable to hold together. And a broken thing, even an immortal one, can eventually be taken apart. There is a final, quiet horror in imagining what that internal war meant for the beings caught in it. These were not strangers turning on strangers. They had been comrades, members of the same host, warriors who had once stood together against the worst the world could produce. To fall so far that you would turn on the very beings who had fought beside you through the darkest war in history is to lose something almost impossibly deep. The Darkin did not just betray the world. They betrayed each other, and in doing so, they betrayed the last remnant of who they had been. It is against that backdrop of total ruin that the memory of those who tried to hold the line becomes so poignant. Not every Ascended fell. This is easy to lose sight of when the story is told through the Darkin, but it is one of the most important facts in the whole history, and it changes how we understand what happened. The corruption of the Void War did not claim all of the God Warriors. Some of them held on to who they had been, kept their purpose and their loyalty and their sense of themselves, and did not become the monsters that so many of their comrades became. The fall was not inevitable. It was a catastrophe that swept up many of the Ascended, but not all, and that distinction matters enormously. The existence of Ascended who did not fall tells us that the corruption was not a simple matter of the war being too hard or the enemy being too terrible for anyone to withstand. If that had been the case, all of them would have fallen. Instead, some endured the same war, faced the same horrors, carried the same immortal burden, and came through it still themselves. Whatever it was that broke the Darkin, it was not something that broke every being who encountered it. That leaves us with a harder and more human question. The question of what separated the ones who fell from the ones who did not. And the answer is not something the accounts spell out cleanly. At the head of the host, in the old tellings, stood a great leader who fought to keep the Ascended whole against exactly the corruption that was pulling them apart. The warrior queen remembered in those accounts, tied to the sun and standing at the front of her people, carried the burden of trying to hold together beings who were being ground down by an endless war. Her role was not only to fight the enemy in front of her, it was to fight the slow dissolution happening within her own ranks, to keep the God Warriors recognizable to themselves as the war did everything in its power to strip that away. Hers is a story worth confirming in its details, but the shape of it, a leader standing against the fall of her own people, is one of the most affecting threads in the entire history. That she could not save all of them is part of what makes her memory so heavy. The very best leadership the Ascended had, the strongest will at the head of the host, was not enough to stop the corruption from claiming so many of the god warriors. This was not a failure of effort or courage. It was a demonstration that some forces are simply larger than any single will can hold back. That a war with no ending, applied to beings who could not escape it, will eventually break even those who are fighting hardest to stay whole. The line was held for a time by beings who gave everything to hold it, and still the Darkin emerged from the ranks of the Ascended, one fallen hero at a time. The Ascended who did not fall represent the road the Darkin did not take, the version of the god warriors that kept its soul. Their stories run in other directions across the history of Shurima and the wider world, and they stand as a quiet rebuke to the idea that the Darkin were simply doomed. The Darkin were not doomed. They were broken by a specific and terrible war in a way that other beings faced and did not succumb to. That makes their fall a tragedy rather than a fate, a thing that happened to them rather than a thing they always were. And a tragedy, unlike a fate, carries with it the ache of all the ways it might have gone otherwise. Holding the fallen and the unfallen side by side is the clearest way to understand what the Darkin lost. They were not a separate breed of monster set apart from the heroes of their age. They were the heroes of their age, the same beings who took a different road at the end of the same war their unfallen comrades survived. The god warriors who kept their souls show us exactly what the Darkin threw away, or had taken from them. And standing in that gap between what they were and what they became is the whole weight of their story. It is a weight worth carrying as we look more closely at the strange enemy whose shadow still falls across everything the Darkin became, the enemy whose war did the breaking. To understand why the war against the Void broke the Ascended when other wars had not, you have to sit for a while with what the Void actually is, because it is not an enemy in the way any other enemy in the world is an enemy. Every war the Ascended had won before was a war against something, a kingdom, an army, a rival power with goals and borders, and a will that could be broken. The Void has none of that. It is closer to an absence given hunger, a nothing that wants to unmake something, and fighting it is unlike fighting anything else that exists. Consider what it means to wage war against a thing that does not want territory, does not want submission, does not want anything a treaty could grant, and simply wants to consume. There is no victory condition in the ordinary sense. You cannot capture its capital, because it has none. You cannot kill its king, because there is no king. You cannot force it to surrender, because it does not have the kind of mind that surrenders. It seeps, it erodes, it turns the living world into more of itself, and it does this with a patience that has no bottom. Because the Void does not tire, and does not fear, and does not stop. To fight it is to push against an ocean, gaining ground only to watch that ground dissolve behind you. For beings raised on victory, this was a uniquely corrosive kind of warfare. The Ascended had built their entire identity on the certainty of winning, on being the answer to every threat, the force that turned back whatever came. Against the Void, that certainty had nothing to hold on to. They won engagements and it changed nothing. They cleared regions and the corruption crept back. They fought with everything they had, and the enemy simply kept coming, indifferent to their strength, unmoved by their courage, unstoppable in the only sense that mattered, which was that it could not be finished. That experience, repeated across years and then centuries, does something to a mind that a normal war never could. There is also the sheer horror of what fighting the void would have exposed them to, though the accounts leave much of it in shadow, which is perhaps appropriate. An enemy that unmakes the living world is not an enemy you fight cleanly. The things the Ascended must have witnessed in that war, the ways the corruption warps and consumes what it touches, the sights and the losses accumulated across a conflict with no end would have pressed on even the strongest will. And unlike mortal soldiers, the Ascended could not eventually die and be free of those memories. They carried every horror forward, layered on top of one another, with no death to release them and no clean victory to redeem the suffering. The war offered them nothing but more war. This is why it was the Void, specifically, that produced the Darkin. It was not merely that the war was long, though it was. It was not merely that the enemy was strong, though it was. It was that the enemy was the kind of thing that could not be beaten in the way the Ascended understood beating an enemy, an unmaking force that offered no resolution, no closure, no end. And that ground away at beings who had never before faced a foe they could not eventually defeat. The Void did not corrupt the Ascended by infecting them, as far as the clearest tellings suggest. It corrupted them by making them fight a war that no being was meant to fight, for longer than any being was meant to endure, with no possibility of the victory their entire nature demanded. And here is the final shadow the Void casts across the whole story. The Icathians who first unleashed it were destroyed by it, swallowed by the very weapon they had reached for, and the province that had rebelled fell and was sealed away. But the consequences of that one desperate choice did not end with Icathia. They reached into the ranks of the Ascended and broke the finest of them into the Darkin, and through the Darkin, that single act of reckless desperation went on to devastate the wider world for ages. The Void's most lasting wound may not be the destruction it caused directly. It may be the heroes it turned into monsters, whose corruption outlived the war, outlived the Empire, and reaches into the present still. In that sense, the shadow of the Void never fully lifted, and one of the clearest places you can trace it is in how far the Darkin's weapons eventually spread. When the Darkin War finally ended and the fallen god warriors were sealed into weapons, those weapons did not stay in one place. They were scattered, lost, buried, and carried far from the desert where the Empire of the Sun had raised the Ascended in the first place. This scattering is easy to overlook, but it matters enormously, because it explains why the threat of the Darkin is not confined to the ruins of one fallen civilization. It is spread across the world, waiting in places that have no memory of Shurima at all. The clearest proof of this reach is Varus, whose essence was bound not in the Shuriman sands, but in Ionia, that distant land of spirits and old magic, far from where the Ascended had fallen. His weapon waited there, tied to a temple, until two Ionian hunters came seeking a power that could save them, and found instead an ancient Darkin. Ionia is a world away from Shurima in almost every sense. Its culture, its magic, its whole character, and yet a Darkin lay sealed within it, patient across the ages, ready to return through the first hands desperate enough to reach for it. If one of the oldest Darkin could end up bound in a temple in Ionia, then the weapons that hold these beings could be anywhere. This changes the shape of the threat considerably. It would be one thing if all the Darkin lay sealed in a single buried city, a known danger in a known place, something the world could in principle guard against or avoid. Instead, they are dispersed, hidden in ruins and vaults, and forgotten corners scattered across many lands, most of which have no idea what they hold. The people of Ionia did not know they lived near a sealed god warrior of ancient Shurima, and they had no reason to. The empire that produced the Darkin fell thousands of years ago, and the reasons behind those beautiful, terrible weapons blurred into legend long before most of the world's current nations even existed. That dispersal also means the Darkin can return in places and among peoples who share none of the old history that might warn them. A Shuriman who unearthed an ancient weapon might, at least, carry some fragment of legend about the god warriors and the horror they became. But a Darkin weapon that surfaces in a distant land arrives among people with no such warning. No cultural memory of what they are handling, no reason to suspect that the powerful blade or bow they have found is anything other than a remarkable relic. The corruption spreads most easily where the memory of it has been most completely lost, and across most of the world that memory is gone entirely. Naafiri's reawakening in the desert and Varus's binding in Ionia together sketch the geography of the threat. In the sands of the old empire, the Darkins surface close to where they fell, in the very heartland of the ascension that raised them. Far away, in lands with wholly different histories, their weapons wait among people who have never heard their true story. The Darkin are not a local danger. They are a world-spanning one, seeded across many places by the scattering that followed their war, and any of those seeds can bloom into a returned god warrior the moment the wrong hand closes around the wrong weapon. There is a quiet dread in that image. The idea of these weapons resting in unknown places all over the world. Each one a returned Darkin waiting to happen. The world has largely forgotten the god warriors of ancient Shurima, has let their story fade into fragments and legend, has moved on across thousands of years into new nations and new concerns. But the weapons remember. The essence sealed inside each of them remembers. And scattered though they are, forgotten though they may be, they remain exactly what they were when they were first hidden away, patient, conscious, and hungry for the hand that will set them free. Which raises the question that haunts anyone who understands what the Darkin are. The question of whether there is any way to truly stop them at all. The hardest question in the whole history of the Darkin is also the most practical one. If these beings cannot be killed, if sealing them only pauses them, if they return again and again by consuming the living, then the world faces a genuine problem. The question of whether there is any real way to stop them, or whether it is condemned to face them forever, one returned god warrior at a time. The honest answer, drawn from everything their story shows, is that stopping a Darkin is far harder than anyone would wish, and that the tools the world has are limited and grim. The first tool is the one the ancient world used. The sealing itself. It is the only method that has ever demonstrably worked against a Darkin, and it worked not by defeating them, but by containing them. Bound into a weapon of dark and living metal, a Darkin can be held, silenced, kept from acting on the world for as long as its weapon goes untouched. But sealing is not victory. It does not end the Darkin, it imprisons it. And an imprisoned Darkin is a threat merely deferred, waiting inside its cage for the moment a living hand sets it loose again. The world did not defeat the Darkin in the ancient age. It postponed them, and that postponement has been running out, weapon by weapon, ever since. The second possibility lies in the struggle between a Darkin and its host, and here there is a thin and uncertain thread of something like hope. Rast has not yet consumed Cain. The assassin still fights, day after day, to keep from being devoured, and the outcome of that struggle is genuinely undecided. It suggests that a strong enough might, at least sometimes, resist the corruption, might hold on where so many others have been consumed. But it would be a mistake to read too much comfort into that. Rast is patient, and time is entirely on his side, and the history of the Darkin is a history of wielders who believed they were strong enough and were wrong. The struggle offers a possibility of resistance, not a promise of it, and the odds are heavily on the side of the ancient hunger. Naafiri opens a stranger door, the possibility that the relationship between a Darkin and a host need not be a war at all. Her instinct toward partnership, toward seeing a host as a member of a pack rather than a body to be devoured, suggests a way of coexisting with a Darkin that the others do not offer. But this too must be held with real caution, because Naafiri remains a Darkin, a corrupted god warrior, a predator at her core, and partnership with such a being is not the same as safety from it. Her way may be less immediately destructive than the pure consumption the others practice, but it is not redemption, and it is not a solution to what the Darkin are. It is, at most, a different and less obviously hostile face of the same ancient danger. And then there is Aatrox, who complicates the question of stopping a Darkin in the darkest way possible, because Aatrox does not want to be stopped in the sense of being contained. He wants to be released, and the release he seeks is the end of all things. To stop Aatrox is not merely to hold him. It is to stand between a being of immense power and the oblivion he longs for with the full weight of his ancient grief behind him. He is not a conqueror who can be talked down or bargained with, because he does not want what conquerors want. He wants the end, and a being that wants the end, and cannot die, and has spent ages nursing that desire, is perhaps the most difficult thing in the world to truly stop. So the answer to whether a Darkin can be stopped is a sobering one. They can be sealed, which is not the same as beaten. They can sometimes, perhaps, be resisted by a strong enough host, though the odds are grim. They can, in Naafiri's case, apparently be joined within something other than pure war, though that is not the same as being made safe. But they cannot, by any method the world has found, be truly ended, because ending is the one thing their immortality forbids. The world can hold them off, can imprison them, can struggle against them, but it cannot finish them. And that is the shadow the Darkin cast over everything they touch. They are a problem with no clean solution, a horror that can only ever be managed, never resolved. Which brings us back at last to where we began, and to what the Darkin, in the end, truly mean. It is worth pausing on the weapons themselves, because they are among the strangest objects in the whole history of the world, and understanding them adds a layer to the horror of the Darkin that is easy to miss. These are not ordinary weapons that happen to be dangerous. They are prisons, forged with intent, crafted specifically to hold beings that could not otherwise be held, and everything about them serves that grim purpose. A Darkin weapon is a cage that looks like a gift, and that disguise is central to how the Darkin keep returning. The forging of these prisons was itself an extraordinary act. Faced with an enemy that could not be killed, the mages and smiths of the ancient world had to invent a way to contain the uncontainable, to pour the vast power and endless hunger of a god warrior into the shape of an object and lock it there. The dark, living metal they used was not chosen for its beauty or its edge, but for its ability to hold what nothing else could hold. The enduring essence of a Darkin. Each weapon is a feat of desperate craft, a solution reached only because every other solution had failed, and the fact that it worked at all is a testament to how far the ancient world was willing to go to survive beings it could not defeat. But a prison shaped like a weapon carries a fatal flaw, and it is a flaw built into its very nature. A weapon is meant to be picked up. That is what a weapon is for, and a powerful, beautiful one practically calls out to be wielded. So the very form chosen to contain the Darkin is the form most likely to end up in a living hand, and every time that happens, the prison begins to fail and the Darkin begins to return. The ancient world locked its monsters inside the one kind of object that people are most drawn to reach for, and in doing so guaranteed that the monsters would eventually get out, again and again, across all the ages to come. There is a cruelty in how these weapons present themselves to a potential wielder. They do not announce their true nature. They offer power, strength, the intoxicating sense of becoming far more than you were, and they conceal the price behind that promise until it is too late to refuse it. A person who finds a Darkin weapon in a moment of need feels the gift, not the trap. They feel the strength flowing into them, the sudden capacity to survive or to triumph, and by the time the feeding begins in earnest, by the time they understand that the weapon is consuming them, the choice to put it down has usually already been taken from them. The beauty and the power are the lure, and the erasure is the hook. The weapons also shape what the Darkin becomes when it returns, which is a detail that reveals just how completely they bind the essence within them to a particular form. When Aatrox's blade takes a host, it does not simply let the ancient warrior wear the body as it was. It reshapes that body, drains it, remakes it into a towering winged figure of terrible power, the specific form the blade imposes on whatever hand takes it up. The weapon is not a neutral container. It is an active thing that stamps its Darkin's shape onto its victim, turning a person into the vessel the weapon requires. The prison does not only hold the monster, it rebuilds the world around itself in the monster's image, one host at a time. To look at a Darkin weapon, then, is to look at one of the most concentrated horrors the ancient world ever produced. An object that is simultaneously a prison, a lure, and an engine of transformation. It holds a broken god warrior. It calls out to be wielded. And it remakes whoever answers that call into a new body for the horror within. The mages who forged these things saved their world with them, but they also created objects that would go on threatening that world for as long as they existed, because the solution they built carried its own undoing inside it. And inside each of these beautiful prisons, beneath the hunger and the power, there remains a harder question still, the question of what, if anything, is left of the hero who was sealed there. Perhaps the most haunting question in the entire history of the Darkin is whether anything of the original hero survives inside the monster. When an Ascended fell and became a Darkin, the god warrior they had been was either simply erased, replaced entirely by the corrupted thing that emerged from the war, or else some remnant of the hero remained, buried beneath the hunger and the cruelty, aware of what it had become. The answer, as far as their story allows us to reach it, is unsettling, because at least in one case, the hero is very much still there. Aatrox is the proof of this, and it is what makes him so much more than a simple monster. He remembers being a hero. He remembers the war that broke him, the betrayal of his sealing, the endless silence of his imprisonment. This is not the memory of an outside observer looking back on someone else's fall. It is the memory of the one who lived it, carried forward intact into the being he is now. The Aatrox that walks the world today knows exactly what he once was, knows the glory he has lost, and rages against the injustice done to him with the full awareness of a hero who understands precisely how far he has fallen. The God Warrior did not vanish. He remained, and he remembers everything. That continuity of memory transforms the tragedy completely. If the Darkin were simply new beings who had replaced the old heroes, their fall would be a loss, but a clean one. A matter of good beings being destroyed and evil beings taking their place. Instead, the same being persists across the whole arc, hero and monster alike, aware of both. The being who longs for oblivion is the same being who once protected the world, and he carries the memory of that protection inside him even as he marches toward the end of everything. He is not a stranger wearing the hero's history. He is the hero, continued into ruin, conscious of every step of the descent. This raises a possibility almost too painful to hold, the possibility that inside a Darkin, some part of the original hero is not just remembered, but present, trapped, forced to witness what it has become. If Aatrox retains the memory and the awareness of the God Warrior he was, then in some sense that God Warrior is still there, still conscious, still carrying the knowledge of everything he once stood for, now bound inside a being that wants only the end of all things. The hero did not get to die when the monster was born. The hero has to keep existing, aware, inside the monster, which may be the cruelest fate the whole story contains. Death would at least have ended the hero cleanly. Instead, the hero endures, imprisoned not only in a weapon, but inside the corrupted self the war created. It also reframes what it would even mean to fight a Darkin like Aatrox. To strike him down, if such a thing were possible, would be to strike down not only the monster, but the hero still remembered within him. The fallen protector who was broken by doing exactly what his people asked. There is no clean enemy to hate here, no pure evil to destroy without cost. There is a being who was once among the finest the world produced, corrupted by a war he did not choose, and imprisoned by the very people he protected, carrying the full memory of all of it into a present where he wants only to end. The hero and the monster cannot be separated, because they are the same being, and to face one is to face the other. Whether every Darkin retains this awareness as fully as Aatrox does is not something the clearest tellings settle. And it is worth holding that uncertainty honestly. But Aatrox alone is enough to establish the terrible truth at the center of it. The fall of the Darkin did not erase the heroes. It buried them alive inside what they became, carrying their memory and their grief forward across the ages, aware of everything they had lost. That is why the Darkin are not simply monsters to be feared. They are heroes to be mourned, still present inside the horror, and mourning them is the last thing their story asks of us before it returns, one final time, to where it began. There is a way of seeing the Darkin that sets them within the larger story of the empire that made them, and it is a perspective worth taking before the story closes, because the Darkin are not only individual tragedies. They are the darkest inheritance of a whole civilization, the shadow cast by the very things that made Shurima magnificent. The empire that could raise mortals into gods was also, by that same power, the empire that produced the beings who nearly destroyed the world. And the two cannot be pulled apart. Everything that made the Darkin possible came from Shurima's greatness. The sun disk that channeled the sun's power, the ritual of ascension that lifted champions into god warriors, the entire apparatus that made the Ascended the pride of the empire, all of it was the achievement of a civilization at the height of its powers. Shurima did not stumble into creating the Ascended. It built the means to do so deliberately, as an expression of everything it had mastered, and for a long era, that mastery served it well. The God Warriors were the Empire's crowning accomplishment, proof of what a civilization could reach when it commanded power on that scale. But the same mastery that raised the Ascended is what made the Darkin possible. Because you cannot create beings of that power without also creating the possibility of that power going wrong. The Ascended were near immortal, immensely strong, built to endure anything. And those qualities were gifts only so long as the beings who carried them remained whole. The moment the war against the void broke that wholeness, those same gifts became the engine of a catastrophe. Shurima's greatest creation and Shurima's greatest horror were the same creation, viewed before and after the war that turned one into the other. The empire that reached highest also fell furthest, and the Darkin are the measure of that fall. This casts the whole history of Shurima in a particular light. We tend to remember the Empire's fall through its more famous catastrophe: the betrayal at the Emperor's ascension, the sorcerer's treachery, the sinking of the great cities into the sand. But the Darkin represent an earlier and in some ways deeper wound, a failure that came not from betrayal at the top, but from the very heart of what the Empire did best. Shurima's power to create gods carried within it the power to create monsters. And the war against the void was the moment that hidden cost came due. The Empire's brightest achievement became its darkest legacy, and that legacy outlived the Empire itself by thousands of years. Because that is the final irony of Shurima's inheritance. The Empire fell. Its cities were buried, its people scattered, its name faded into the kind of legend that most of the world only half remembers. But the Darkin it created did not fall with it. They endured, sealed in their weapons, outliving the very civilization that had raised them up and then broken them, carrying the Empire's darkest legacy forward into ages Shurima never saw. Long after the Empire of the Sun turned to dust, its fallen God Warriors remained, and remain still, the last and most terrible thing the Empire ever made, refusing to pass away with everything else it built. To understand the Darkin fully, then, is to understand something about the danger of greatness itself, about how the same power that lets a civilization achieve wonders can, if it goes wrong, produce horrors on the same scale. Shurima raised mortals into gods, and in doing so, made it possible for those gods to become monsters. The Darkin are the price of ascension, the shadow side of the Empire's greatest triumph, and they stand as a warning written across the ages that the higher a civilization reaches, the further its creations can fall. Shurima reached higher than almost anyone, and the Darkin are how far that reach could fall. That warning, carried in stolen bodies across thousands of years, brings us back at last to the premise where we began, and to what these fallen heroes finally mean. We began with a simple claim, that the greatest heroes the ancient world ever knew became the monsters that same world learned to fear, and that they never truly died. Everything in between has been the working out of that claim, and now, at the end, its full weight can be felt. The Darkin are not villains who arrived from outside to threaten a golden age. They are the golden age itself, corrupted. The very heroes who protected the world, turned into the horror that nearly destroyed it, still walking, thousands of years later, in bodies that were never theirs. That is what makes them one of the most affecting parts of the whole history of the world they inhabit. A monster that comes from outside is frightening. But it is also, in a sense, simple. It is other, alien, something to be fought and feared, without complication. The Darkin are not simple. because they are not other. They came from the best the world had to offer. They were raised up by their own people, sent to war by their own people, broken by that war, and then sealed away by the very people they had bled to protect. Every part of their tragedy is bound up with the world that made them, and there is no clean line to draw between the heroes they were and the monsters they became, because they are the same beings. Their story is, above all, a warning about immortality and about war, the two forces that shaped them. Immortality, the dream mortals have chased across all of history, turns out in the Darkin to be a curse that removes the one escape from suffering and leaves a being trapped in whatever horror finds it. War, the thing the Ascended were built to win, turns out to be able to break even the finest souls if it is made endless enough, grinding heroes into monsters not through any single dramatic corruption, but through the slow accumulation of horror across ages. The Darkin are what you get when you give beings everything, and then subject them to more than any being was meant to bear, and take away their ability to ever stop bearing it. And still they persist, which is the final and most unsettling part of the claim we began with. They never truly died, because they could not, and so they endure, sealed in weapons scattered across a world that has mostly forgotten them, returning one at a time whenever another blade finds a hand. Aatrox marches toward the oblivion he longs for, in a body he stole from a dying warrior. Varus walks as a fusion of an ancient corruption and two lovers who reached for it. Rast wears down the assassin who thought he could master him. Naafiri hunts the sands as a pack, seeing partners where her kin saw prey. And somewhere in the ruins, more of them wait, patient and conscious and hungry, for the moment their long silence ends. The world that made them has changed beyond all recognition. The empire of the sun fell. The cities were buried. The people who sealed the Darkin away turned to dust, and the reasons behind those beautiful, terrible weapons blurred into legend and then into nothing. But the Darkin remained through all of it, unchanged in the ways that matter, carrying the same grief and the same fury and the same hunger they carried when they were first sealed away in an age no one now remembers. They are the past that refuses to stay in the past, the ancient tragedy that keeps reaching forward into the present to claim new lives and continue itself. So when you encounter a Darkin, in whatever form, it is worth remembering what you are actually looking at. Not simply a monster, and not simply a weapon, but a hero who was broken by the world's own war, imprisoned by the world's own hand, and sentenced by their own immortality to endure all of it without end. The Darkin are the cost of the ancient wars made flesh, the price the world paid for its salvation, still being paid. One stolen life at a time. They were the shield of Shurima. They became the thing that shattered it. And they will go on becoming that, wherever their weapons are found, for as long as there are hands foolish, or desperate, or unlucky enough to reach out and pick them up. That is the complete history of the Darkin, and the reason it is not, and may never be, complete.